A city of 3 million people, surrounded, no food coming in, no escape going out. The temperature dropped to minus 40 degrees, and the bread ration fell so low that a single day's allowance could fit inside a human palm. Children stopped crying, not because they were safe, but because they no longer had the strength. And yet, the city did not fall. What kept it standing when everything said it should have died? The answer is darker and more extraordinary than history has ever been allowed to say. Welcome to WWII Ghost Wings. This is a place where real history is told with the respect and the depth it deserves. No shortcuts, no sensationalism, just the truth as it actually happened. If this is the first time here, it will mean a great deal to have you stay. Subscribing takes just a moment, and it ensures that stories like this one keep finding their way to those who truly appreciate them. For anyone who has been here before, welcome back. This community grows more wonderful with every passing week. A quick question before the story begins. Where in the world is this being watched from today? Whether it is a quiet evening in England, a Sunday morning in Canada, or somewhere halfway across the globe, drop the location in the comments. It is always a joy to see how far these stories travel. If real, unfiltered history stirs something, go ahead and press that like button and turn on the notification bell so that the next story never arrives without warning. Now the story begins. Before the first shell fell, before the first child went to bed hungry, there was a decision made in a room far from Leningrad, a decision that had nothing to do with military strategy. It was personal. Leningrad was not simply a city on a map. It was an idea. And to Adolf Hitler, ideas could be just as dangerous as armies. Named after Vladimir Lenin himself, the city stood as a living symbol of Soviet communism, the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution, the spiritual capital of everything the Third Reich had sworn to destroy. Hitler did not want to capture Leningrad. He wanted it gone, not occupied, not subdued, erased so completely that, in his own recorded words, it would sink into the earth and leave nothing worth remembering. This distinction would determine the fate of 3 million people. In the summer of 1941, Germany's Army Group North drove east with terrifying speed. Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history, had torn open the Soviet frontier like paper. Wehrmacht divisions moved through the Baltic states in weeks. Soviet resistance, though fierce in places, collapsed under the weight of superior coordination and total strategic surprise. Joseph Stalin had been warned. British intelligence had passed credible reports of the coming invasion. His own generals had seen the signs. But Stalin, consumed by paranoia, certain it was a provocation designed to pull the Soviet Union into war prematurely, had refused to act. That refusal cost Leningrad everything. By early September 1941, Army Group North had completed what military historians would later call one of the most consequential encirclements of the entire war. The last land road connecting Leningrad to the rest of the Soviet Union was severed. Finnish forces pressed from the north. German divisions locked the south and east. 3 million civilians, men, women, the elderly, and the very young, were now sealed inside a closing ring of steel. No one in power told them how long it would last. No one in power knew that it would last 872 days. If this story is already pulling at something, go ahead and give it a like and share it with someone who believes real history deserves to be heard. The next chapter is where the dying truly begins. September 8th, 1941, a date that appears in history books as a single line, a footnote, a timestamp for the people of Leningrad. It was the last ordinary day that would exist for the next 2.5 years. That morning, German forces seized Schlüsselburg, a small town on the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. It was not a famous battle. No grand names are attached to it. No celebrated commanders claimed it as a defining moment. But that quiet, almost unremarkable capture completed the encirclement. The ring was closed. And somewhere inside Wehrmacht headquarters, the calculation was already being made, not in terms of bullets or battalions, but in something far colder, calories. German military planners understood precisely what sealing Leningrad meant. The city held food reserves estimated to last no more than 1 to 2 months. There would be no dramatic final assault. No costly street-by-street battle through a city of 3 million. The strategy was simpler, and in its simplicity, more horrifying than any direct attack could have been. Leningrad would be starved to death. Wehrmacht High Command put it in writing. Documented orders stated that surrender from the city's population should not be accepted. Civilians attempting to flee through German lines were to be turned back by force. The intent was explicit. The city was not to be fed. It was not to be relieved. It was to be consumed by its own hunger until nothing capable of resistance remained. This was not a military operation. It was a sentence. Inside the city, the rationing began almost immediately. By November 1941, the daily bread allocation for a factory worker had fallen to 250 grams. For everyone else, dependents, children, the elderly, it dropped to 125 grams. 125 grams of bread. Historians have placed that amount on modern scales for perspective. It sits in the hand like a small stone. It was everything. It was the line between waking the next morning and not. And the bread itself was not bread in any real sense. It was a composite of whatever could be ground and bound together. Sawdust, cellulose, cottonseed cake, flour swept from the floors of empty warehouses. People ate it and called it bread because there was no other word left to use. The one fragile hope was Lake Ladoga, the vast body of water, sitting just east of the encirclement. During the brief autumn window, boats pushed supplies across its surface under constant German bombardment. When winter arrived and the lake froze solid, trucks began moving across the ice in convoys so dangerous that drivers were instructed to keep their doors open so that when a vehicle broke through, there was at least a chance of jumping free before the water took everything. Thousands of tons of supplies crossed that ice road. It was never enough. The city's death toll in the winter of 1941 alone is estimated between 100,000 and 200,000 souls, most of them civilians, most of them elderly, most of them simply too weak to survive one more morning. What does it mean to choose who eats and who does not? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. This moment in history carries a weight that deserves to be spoken about. The next part goes to the darkest place this story reaches. There's a kind of cold that does not simply lower the temperature. It enters a city the way an army enters a city, street by street, building by building, room by room. And in the winter of 1941, Leningrad learned that the cold could be just as deliberate as any enemy. The heating systems failed first. Coal reserves, already critically depleted, ran out before December ended. Pipes froze inside apartment walls. Windows that had been shattered by German shelling were stuffed with rags, with clothing, with pages torn from books, anything to slow the intrusion of air that regularly dropped to minus 30, minus 40 degrees Celsius. People began burning furniture to survive, then books, then the wooden frames of doors and floorboards pried up from their own homes. A city that had once housed one of the greatest library collections in the Soviet Union watched its own culture disappear board by board into small iron stoves called burzwikas, improvised heaters that glowed for a few hours and then went dark. The electricity was gone. The tram stopped running. The water system collapsed entirely. Leningrad, once among the most sophisticated cities in all of Europe, had been reduced, within a single season, to something resembling the medieval, and yet the dying was only partially about cold. The hunger was the engine of it. By January 1942, the mortality rate inside the city had reached figures that even Soviet record keepers, trained to minimize, to sanitize, to report only what the state permitted, could not fully conceal. Estimates placed the death toll during that single month at over 100,000 people. Bodies appeared in the streets because the living no longer had the strength to bury them. Corpses were stacked in courtyards, in snowdrifts, against the walls of buildings, waiting for the ground to thaw enough to receive them. Starvation does not announce itself the way violence does. It is quiet, and it is slow, and it dismantles a person from the inside. First, the body consumes its own fat, then its muscle, then, in the final stages, a person's face takes on a quality that survivors describe with the same word. Again and again, transparent. What history has been slower to acknowledge, and what Soviet censors worked deliberately to suppress for decades, is that cannibalism entered Leningrad during that winter. NKVD records, declassified long after the Soviet collapse, documented over 2,000 arrests for cases, involving the consumption of human flesh during the siege. These were not monsters. They were people at the absolute outermost edge of what a human being can endure, pushed there by a combination of German siege policy and Soviet decisions that consistently prioritized military supply lines over civilian survival. The soldiers at the front received more. The factories received more. The civilians, particularly the elderly and the children, received what was left. What was left was almost nothing. Then came January 12, 1943. Operation Iskra, Operation Spark, was launched along a narrow corridor south of Lake Ladoga. Soviet forces attacked simultaneously from the east and from within the city itself, grinding through heavily fortified German positions across 11 days of brutal, close-range combat. On January 18, 1943, the two Soviet forces met. A corridor had been opened, narrow, barely 11 kilometers wide at its thinnest point, and still under constant German artillery fire. But it was open. Supplies moved through it. Rail lines were hastily laid across the frozen ground. Food entered the city for the first time in over a year through a land route. The siege was not over. The guns did not stop. German forces would continue to shell Leningrad for another full year. But the moment had shifted. The city had survived what had been designed to be unsurvivable. And everyone who witnessed that corridor open knew, with a certainty that required no announcement, that Leningrad was not going to die. The decisions made inside that siege by generals, by politicians, by ordinary people pushed beyond the boundary of ordinary endurance, deserve to be examined and discussed. Leave a thought in the comments. What strikes hardest about this moment? On January 27, 1944, the guns finally went quiet. After 872 days, the siege of Leningrad was over. The people who remained in the streets that night did not cheer the way history imagines survivors cheer. They stood, they wept, and many of them simply looked at one another as if confirming that the other was real. The fireworks that lit the Leningrad sky that evening were the first since the war began. Stalin authorized a 24-gun salute, a rare honor reserved for the most significant Soviet victories. State radio broadcast the announcement with language carefully constructed to frame the liberation as the inevitable triumph of Soviet strength and communist will. What it did not broadcast, what would not broadcast for decades, was the true cause of what had just ended. The official Soviet death toll for the siege of Leningrad was listed at 632,000 civilian casualties. It was a number designed to be large enough to acknowledge sacrifice, and small enough to avoid the deeper questions an accurate figure would have demanded. Modern historical research, drawing on declassified Soviet records, German military documentation, and post-Soviet demographic analysis, places the real number of civilian deaths at somewhere between 800,000 and 1.5 million people. The majority did not die from German shells. They died from hunger, from cold, from decisions made in offices far from the siege line. And then, with extraordinary speed, Stalin moved to ensure that the people most associated with Leningrad's survival would never be in a position to speak about it too loudly. The Leningrad affair of 1949 remains one of the most cynical political purges in Soviet history. The city's wartime leadership, the men and women who had organized the defense, managed the rationing, kept the factories producing under bombardment, and maintained enough civil order to prevent complete collapse, were arrested, tried on fabricated charges of treason and separatism, and executed or sent to the labor camps. Nikolai Voznesensky, a senior Soviet economic planner who had been instrumental in coordinating Leningrad's wartime survival and had risen to become one of the most powerful figures in the post-war Soviet government, was shot in 1950. The Leningrad Museum of the Defense, which had been carefully assembled to honor the siege's survivors and document its history, was ordered shut. Its exhibits were destroyed. Its curators were arrested. Stalin did not want a city of heroes. He wanted a city of subjects. Survivors were left to carry the weight of what they had witnessed largely in silence. To speak too openly about the realities of the siege, the starvation, the cannibalism, the failures of Soviet supply policy, the knowledge that many deaths could have been prevented, was to risk the kind of attention no Soviet citizen wanted in the years after the war. The women who had dragged bodies through frozen streets, the children who had watched their parents disappear into that terrible transparency of starvation, The drivers who had steered trucks across cracking ice in the dark, carrying flour and hope in equal measure. They returned to ordinary life carrying memories that the state had formally instructed them to soften. It would take the collapse of the Soviet Union itself before the full architecture of what happened in Leningrad could begin to be properly examined. What the Siege of Leningrad ultimately reveals. Beneath the heroism, beneath the suffering, beneath the extraordinary human endurance that kept the city alive against every calculation that said it should have fallen, is a truth that repeats itself across the whole of history. Ordinary people, placed inside extraordinary circumstances by the decisions of powerful men, will endure things that defy the limits of what endurance is supposed to mean. And then, when it is over, power will attempt to own the story. Leningrad endured Hitler. It endured starvation. It endured 872 days of manufactured death. The one thing its people were never fully protected from was a government that called them heroes while erasing everything that made that word true. If the story moves something in you, share it with someone who believes real history deserves to be told completely, not just conveniently. And if this channel has earned a place in a regular watch routine, subscribing means these stories will always find their way through. For the next story, stay close. The next video on this channel reaches into another chapter of the Second World War that history has never quite told honestly enough. This has been WWII Ghost Wings. Until next time, remember those who were never allowed to be remembered.